Recording in progress.
Composting our faith. So I was asked recently whether Unitarian Universalism was a religion or really a philosophy. And I had to think about it. Was it really a religion, a philosophy, both? Do I really even care? So I went out and did a little research, and there's a website called atheistliving.com that came up with this really cool graph. You probably want to make it bigger in the room here so people can see it. And I know it's even still hard to read. But the whole idea is that on the right-hand side, it's philosophy, and it's in green, and the purple side is religion in purple. And in the center, it says there's a lot of space where we deal with the same kinds of questions, those kind of metaphysical questions. Where do we come from? What is the meaning of life? What should we do or feel? What happens when we die? And what is good or bad? All those kinds of questions are often asked. And then on each side of it, they give very specific, that according to them is unique to one or the other. So on the philosophy side, they talk about it's all grounded in observations, questions, and proof. And on the religion side, it's about rituals and answers and faith. So on the website, they give a little bit more narrative to help explain what you see in the visual. So under religion, it says, when religion strives to understand the nature or purpose of human existence and the universe around us, it finds answers through its own dogma and the authority of its own leaders. The answers are commonly obtained through a supernatural process, for example, prophets, inspired scriptures, signs, or miracles. And religions generally involve worshiping a higher being or creator. Followers of a religion may see their beliefs as truth. However, it is generally agreed that these beliefs are a matter of faith. It is true because they have faith in the messages from their supernatural God or gods. On the philosophy side, it says philosophy involves the rational pursuit of knowledge and a general understanding about the nature and purpose of the universe. Philosophers look for knowledge primarily through questions and observations, and their theories may be based on the work of earlier philosophers, but previous theories are always open to new interpretations, refinement, or outright contradiction. So I thought that was a good way to do a one versus the other kind of thing. And it made me think, and I thought, my answer is probably classic Unitarian Universalist. I want to debate the answers that are provided in that context. I'd say it's all of the above, depending on the definition of the terms. We have a lot of classic traits of philosophy in our tradition. We tend to rely on trusting rational observations. We're strongly encouraged to ask questions, and we rely heavily on logic, proof, and reason. However, to quote the senior minister at First Unitarian Dallas, Reverend Dr. Daniel Cantor, he says, Unitarian Universalism is a paradigm shifter, and I totally agree with that. Unitarian Universalism is a paradigm shifter. We rely on classic philosophical ways of thinking to approach those metaphysical questions at the center of that diagram. But like traditional religions, we also use ritual, we seek answers, and we have faith. But our paradigm for these terms differs from traditional concepts of religion because nothing is ever required or unchangeable here. So let me go through those three. Rituals. We use rituals, but not in the traditional way. Our Sunday morning services closely resemble Protestant Christian worship since the 17th century. Not much has changed in 400 years. But we do not worship a deity, and nothing is required, like for the forgiveness of sins kind of things. Rituals such as lighting the chalice or communal singing and sharing of joys and concerns, to me, are all part of supporting and building community. And the rituals of using readings or the stories, like I just did in the Time for All Ages, and a reflection, homily, sermon, whatever you want to call what I'm doing right now, are classic ways of teaching a crowd. Traditional religions often refer to teachers like Moses, Muhammad, Jesus, Buddha, other tribal elders. They're the same thing. So rituals, we do it. Answers. Unlike traditional religions, we do not offer the answer or absolute truth. We think of it as a process or a journey. This is what we know right now, and it's going to change as soon as I finish this sermon or as we continue on our journey and ask more questions. And then faith. That's a word that a lot of you use, kind of get like, what do I mean by faith? And we often hear that there's this leap of faith from traditional religions. And often it's the example that's given is we can't really prove the existence of God, but we have to have this leap of faith. Well, Unitarian Universalists don't agree on the existence of anything we can't prove, but we do agree to have faith in hope and eternal optimism. We have faith that humans will gradually evolve into a better world. And I think the best example of that is the famous Theodore Parker quote. He was a Unitarian minister back in the 19th century, and as I read it, some of you will know this quote. I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure it bends towards justice. It has been requoted and requoted and requoted. The moral arc of the universe ultimately ends towards justice. If that is not a strong example of faith, I don't know what is. So let me just adjust my screen here for a minute. So you have a bigger screen. So why is this whole distinction between religion and philosophy important? Because frankly, we compost our faith. Spring compost, again, it's breaking everything down to core elements, nutrients versus non-nutrients. What are our core values that feed our spiritual, mental, and emotional development, both collectively as a fellowship and personally? So for the past several years, we, and by we I mean the entire Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations, of which we're all a part, have collectively been revisiting what our core values are and asking ourselves how they nourish our faith. And right now, we're going to vote on this summer, but right now we've settled on 6. Justice, equity, interdependence, generosity, pluralism, and transformation, which is March's focus. And those were the petals of that flower. Each is essential for a faith focused on love, living a love-centered life. We compost our faith to always be fresh and nourishing to the seeds of love we continually plant in this world. So transformation, I think it's the key to this, to being paradigm shifters. And I had you read it, but I've added some labels to the things we read together a minute ago. So our vision with transformation is we adapt to a changing world. We are not a religion that has a dogma that's been around for 2,000 years and we stick with it constantly again and again and again. We adapt to the changing world around us. And our common goal, we said it, we covenant to collectively transform and grow spiritually and ethically. And then they always give an example in the way this is laid out. Openness to change is fundamental to our Unitarian and Universalist heritages, never complete and never perfect. So I want to give you a few examples of that Unitarian and Universalist heritage, and hopefully you'll understand how over time, whatever was a key issue going on in society, it's something we were always right in the middle of, trying to wrestle it, figure out what is the right thing to do, figure out what was truth. So originally, when the first Unitarians came to this country, it was all about congregational polity, which is a fabulous word. I had no idea what that meant until I went to seminary. It means that each congregation can govern themselves. They're independent of any kind of bureaucracy or hierarchy. And this was the early colonists from England, and they rejected organized religion and its governance, which meant they could decide amongst themselves what they believed was true, what was loving, and more importantly, they could choose whichever minister they wanted. It could be a liberal one, a conservative one. They didn't have to have the bishop give them a minister. Then came transcendentalism. It was the rejection of rigid doctrine. Basically the idea of, you know what, we can discern truth for ourselves. We can focus on the goodness of humankind rather than depravity and sin. And the divine, they believed, was easily accessible, particularly if you go out into nature. And so it was essentially the beginning of a rejection of traditional rigid Christian dogma or doctrine. Then came along the inherent dignity and worthiness of all, which is our first principle now. And it manifested itself with justice becoming this central focus. At the time, the big one was the abolition of slavery, then equal rights for African Americans and women, and then eventually social justice for the poor and the oppressed, particularly migrants, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Then in the mid-20th century, it flipped to humanism. There was this whole idea that humans had agency to change society for the better. There was often these quotes of upward and onward forever, that humans can always improve things and make things better. At the time, there were created ethical societies and philosophy of ethics. Science and reason dominated, and there was a rejection of absolutely all things supernatural. Well, then, kind of as a counter to that, because things aren't upward and onward forever without consequences, the focus became environmentalism and the interdependence of all existence. And then finally, I think when we entered the 21st century, universalism, there was this reintroduction of the spirituality and religious metaphor, an emphasis on spiritual journey and religious exploration replaces this dogmatic humanism. All right, so we're composting our faith again right now. We have this vision to adapt to a changing world, and we've covenanted it to grow amongst ourselves. What does transformation mean to us in 2024? What seeds of love should we be focused on and nourishing? So I really wanted to make a big announcement today, like this big aha. I started enthusiastically considering what would be the next big wave. And I kind of went through a lot of Unitarian Universalist literature, and I thought, you know, it's got to be something that provides this equal opportunity for humans and nature to thrive. It's got to be some philosophy that we embrace where it's just coexistence and everything can thrive sustainably. So I looked up utopianism, which has been around for a long time, imagining what that perfect society would be. I looked up ecocentrism, which is the ethic that was conceived by our own Aldo Leopold and recognizes all species, including humans, are the product of evolution and interrelated in their life processes. I looked up biocentrism, which is this ethical point of view that extends inherent value to all living things. There's a movement right now to be able to assign the right for nature to exist. I even looked up planetarianism, which was about literature and making sure children understood this different altered sense of the world that humans are at the center. And then I started thinking, you know what, Jim, this looks like an old white middle-aged male trying to come up with this conquering of the universe kind of mentality. And I am a big believer that the universe leads us to the music, the readings, the thought, the discussions that we need to hear at the time that we need to hear them, which led me back to the interview with Adrienne Marie Brown, a queer African-American feminist Gen Xer. And I thought, you know what, I should pay attention to what they have to say instead of reinventing it myself. So the interview with Adrienne Marie Brown. There was a lot of big words in there that I don't think a lot of us knew the definitions of. And there were three that I think were important: emergent strategy, fractal, and abolition. So I'll take them one at a time. Emergent strategy is actually a business term. So where do you go when you have a business term? You need to look up Harvard Business School, of course. And so I looked it up, and it said an emergent strategy is one that arises from unplanned actions and initiatives from within an organization. It's typically viewed as the product of spontaneous innovation and often a direct result of the daily prioritization and investment decisions made by individual contributors. Compared to a deliberate strategy, an emergent strategy is often more flexible. Though the organization still has goals it's working towards, there's flexibility to adjust those goals and pursue other opportunities or priorities as they emerge. Hence, it's used a lot by startup companies. Okay, so emergent strategy a la Adrienne Marie Brown. So this comes from the book review by Audible. Here is a radical self-help and planet help to shape the futures we want. Change is constant. The world, our bodies, our minds are in constant state of flux. They are a stream of ever-mutating emerging patterns. Rather than steel ourselves against such change, emergent strategy teaches us to map and assess the swirling structures and to read them as they happen, all the better to shape that which ultimately shapes us, personally and politically. And the final phrase was a resolutely materialist spirituality based equally on science and science fiction, a wild feminist and Afro-futurist ride. All right, that was emergent strategy. The next one's fractal. Maybe a lot of you know what this term was. I couldn't remember exactly. A fractal is a kind of pattern that we observe in nature and in art. And whenever you observe a series of patterns repeating over and over again, think of a nautilus shell at many different scales and where many small parts resemble the whole, that's a fractal. Leaves are a fractal because they keep growing out in the same pattern. And then abolition means stopping something. It's something we practice every day in our lives, she says. So my aha moment at this point was that most of the paradigm shifts in our faith tradition were focused on abolition. They were always against something, stopping something. That congregational polity thing, it was against the orthodoxy of the Church of England. That transcendentalism was against the orthodoxy of all organized religions. The inherent dignity and worthiness of all was against the oppression and treating others differently. African Americans, it was slavery. All women, it was the lack of equal rights to men. Homeless and working poor was a reaction against the unregulated Industrial Revolution. Humanism was against all theism, any kind of belief in the supernatural. Environmentalism was against the environmental degradation going on at the time. And universalism was a counter thing to humanism, against the dogmatism of humanism. So all of this were always these reactions. We want to do this because we don't like that, right? So Brown is advocating for a paradigm shift in thinking. Rather than being against something, focus on what we are for. Her big aha moment was based on fractals. Effective change comes from the smallest part and works its way out to the whole structure. Effective change comes organically from emergent strategy, not this top-down forced execution. So my big aha was the paradigm shift of composting our faith. Break Unitarian Universalism down to its core values and then focus on the catalyst, love. Work from the smallest part out. If we focused, forgot about these values that we're going to vote on, if we focused on living love-centered lives in everything we do, then the core values would naturally emerge. And if we live this way and help create a more loving world at the smallest level, we're impacting the world at the greatest level. So what if our new Unitarian Universalist values were a paradigm shift? What if our new way of thinking, our new focus for the next generation was not centered in a reaction against something, not centered in abolition, stopping something? What if it were truly focused on a creative, organic, positive, generative process called love? What if our descendants look back on this period of Unitarian Universalism and say, that's when the paradigm shift happened? That's when we became a faith focused on love-centered living. And then they would give all these abundant examples of how that manifested itself. Examples that trace the way we live and act in our fellowships, in our communities, and how that organically spread outward and upward to the world. How in 2024, something shifted, a new spiritual awakening, and it was good. Amen. Maybe so. Let's pause for a minute.